I didn't plan to become a secret. I didn't plan to become a test either. But sometimes life hands you a moment so enormous it shrinks everything else to the size of a pin, and you have to decide, will you tell the world and risk losing yourself? Or will you hold it quietly and see who loves you without knowing what you carry? My name is Cassie. I'm 34, the kind of woman who keeps grocery receipts in a ceramic bowl by the sink because budgeting feels like a prayer. I rent the upstairs of a crooked old duplex that sighs when it rains, and I work the early shift at a bakery that smells like forgiveness at 4 a.m. I grew up in a family where love was loud and favors were louder. We're close in the way people are when closeness is survival. Holidays squeezed around a table too small, birthdays paid for with IOUs, apologies cooked into Sunday roast. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The morning my life rewired itself, I was wearing a sweatshirt with flower handprints and a ponytail that hadn't seen sleep. I was on my 15-minute break perched on a milk crate behind the bakery when I checked the numbers for the cheap lottery ticket I'd bought on a dare from our delivery driver. My phone screen was smudged with powdered sugar. When the first number matched, I smiled. When the second matched, I laughed. When the third, fourth, and fifth fell into place and the bonus number snapped on like a final light in a dark hallway, I didn't make a sound. I just held the phone like a live bird and tried to breathe. The world didn't tilt. No violins. The dumpster still hummed with the faint sweetness of yesterday's croissants. A bus sighed, braked, and sighed again on the next street. I pressed my thumb to the cooling metal of the fire exit and whispered, "No way." And then I said it again because some miracles require repetition. I didn't tell anyone. Not the owner when I walked back in with my heart tossing against my ribs like a shoe in a dryer. Not the regular who always says my name too loudly. Not even my best friend Leah who can smell secrets the way a hound finds rain. I finished my shift and went home with a half-price baguette and a secret that glowed like a coal in my chest. That night, I showered, made tea, and sat at my wobbly kitchen table with a notebook that still smelled like the drugstore. I wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page: what now? Here is what now looks like when you are 34 and poor and suddenly rich. You think of the immediate things first. Debt, mom's back payments on the house, the brake pads screaming on your car, the dentist you've avoided for 2 years. You think about time too, time becoming soft and yours mornings without alarms, vacations with corners of sky you haven't touched yet, thighs pressed into warm sand, a lemon tree you swear you'll keep alive this time. You think about generosity, about showing up with checks and shrieks, about placing security in the hands of the people who raised you like it's a bouquet. But then you think about the other things. The jokes at family dinners that landed like pebbles in your shoe, tiny, irritating, unfixable in public. The way your brother Mason counts favors like beads and calls them love. The time your sister Renee said, "You know you'll always be the helper, right?" and smiled as if she'd offered a compliment instead of a prophecy. The way your mother cries gratitude and weaponizes it later. You think about the years you paid your portion of rent on time when they called yours funny money because it came from tips. I turned the page and wrote another question. Who am I to them if I have nothing to give? And then beneath it, a scarier one. Who are they to me if I give everything? I didn't sleep. The money made a noise inside me like a refrigerator hum. Constant, ignorable, maddening. At sunrise, I drove to the claims office with a hoodie and sunglasses like a witness. I didn't want my photo in a frame on a wall. I wanted a private door to open and swallow me whole. The clerk had the kindest face. I kept looking at his hands as if kindness could be contagious through paperwork. When the process was done, my bank account turned into a number that didn't look real. Zeros gathered like geese. I walked out into the light. For a second, I thought about lifting my arms and letting the newness catch me like wind. But I just zipped my hoodie and went home because I didn't know yet how to live as a person who had anything. The first test looked like a casserole dish. Mom called that afternoon voice syrupy with news she'd embroidered herself. Sunday dinner, she said. I'm making the cheesy potatoes you like. She makes them when she wants something. I said yes because I always do, because saying no has never been a language we speak fluently. I told myself I'd hold the secret until I knew how I wanted to spend it. I told myself privacy would protect the part of me that used to look at price tags like forecasts of weather stormy, stormy, stormy. But underneath a different idea sprouted like a weed I couldn't name. Maybe I could learn something before the world learned about me. Maybe I could find out who actually sees me when I have nothing to offer but need. So I made a plan that even now makes me sound colder than I am. I would ask for help, not grand favors, just small, measurable kindnesses from the people who claim to love me. I would do it as I've always done, without drama, without hints that a test was underway, without dangling an invisible prize. I wouldn't trap anyone. I would simply step into the rooms I've always entered and ask to be held. If this is where you decide I'm cruel, know this. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to walk through this experiment and emerge with a list of names I could trust in a storm. I wanted to be able to hand them the future and say, "You earned this because you loved me before you knew." I wanted more than anything for money to be the least interesting thing about this story. The first person I asked was Leah. She has been my best friend since we were 9, when she punched a boy for stealing my pencil and then cried because violence makes her shaky. I called and said, "Can you come over? My sink is, I don't know, sulking. It's clogged." She laughed and said, "I'll bring a wrench and a bottle of wine. Only one of those will help." She arrived 20 minutes later with her hair in a bandana and a jaw set to let me at it. We took apart the P-trap with YouTube prayer and curses. Gray water burped into a bucket. When it was done, she sat on my floor, drank wine from a coffee mug, and told me she'd been thinking of buying me a new set of mixing bowls because mine looked like they survived a mild war. I looked at her and thought, here is a person whose love is always shaped like service. I wanted to tell her everything right then, with the bucket still stinking between us. But my experiment had rules. I swallowed the truth like a pill and tucked the moment away. "Not everyone needs to be tested to be trusted," I wrote later in my notebook. I already know Leah's answer. The next ask was Mason, my older brother who wears ambition like aftershave. He manages a dealership and can tell the year of a car by the shape of its headlight, which would be charming if he didn't speak to people like they were all tourists in a museum built for him. I called and said I was behind on my car payment and could he maybe lend me $300 until payday. He sighed in a key reserved for disappointment and said, "Cass, you know I'm always bailing someone out. I can spot you 100, but you gotta stop letting money sneak up on you." I thanked him and hung up and stared at the ceiling until it stopped spinning. In my notebook, I wrote, "Helps," but keeps a ledger carved in stone. Renee was trickier, my little sister, all eyes and edges. She has a way of turning worry into theater. I asked if she could drive me to a dentist appointment out of town because the local clinic was booked for months. She said, "Ugh, that's my nail day," then added, "I mean, I guess I could move it, if you're like dying." I said I'd figure it out. She texted later, "Can you send me $60? I'll totally pay you back Friday." I Venmoed her because muscle memory is older than dignity. Sunday dinner smelled like rosemary and tactics. Mom hugged me hard at the door and whispered, "I'm so glad you're here," in a way that felt like, "Don't you dare bring a storm into my kitchen." The table was set with the good plates that have survived 3 moves and a divorce. Dad's stepdad, really, but he's earned the noun, folded his napkin into a crooked triangle, and asked about work. I gave the simple answers. Early mornings, good tips, a mean new espresso machine. Mason told a story about a customer who tried to pay in cash and vibes. Renee announced she had a surprise later, which always means a pyramid scheme, or an engagement, or a puppy. Halfway through the potatoes, I cleared my throat. My heart pounded so hard it felt like I was hitting a bass drum with my ribcage. "I hate to ask this," I began, which in my family is code for, "Prepare your sermon, but my rent went up. I'm short this month. 200 would make the difference." Silence. The kind that grows legs and climbs onto the table. Mom blinked and I could see the ledger in her head rearranging like a slide puzzle. Mason took a breath the way people do before they say something about responsibility. Renee stared at her phone, her thumb flicking upward, as if there were answers in other people's lives. Dad spoke first. "I can't help," he said, and my eyes stung because kindness always steals my balance. He added, "It might be tight, but we'll figure it out." Mom's voice softened but didn't sweeten. Cassie, you know things are complicated. The house, my medical bills. If we help you this month, you'll need a plan for next month. I know, I said. I do have a plan. Mason coughed. I can do 50. Renee said nothing. I smiled at Dad and shook my head. It's okay, I'll manage. Mom looked relieved. And something in me, some small bright animal I'd been feeding since the numbers matched, lay down and closed its eyes. I wasn't angry. The experiment wasn't about anger. It was about clarity, the kind you get at the optometrist when they flip the lenses and ask 1 or 2. And slowly the world sharpens in front of you. After dinner, Renee finally made her announcement. She was starting a wellness coaching side hustle, selling teas that promised to cleanse organs most of us didn't realize we owned. She turned toward me with the smile of a shark that reads self-help books. You'd be so good at this, Cass, she said. You know, friendly to broke people. I laughed quietly because laughter was easier than leaving. When I got home, I sat at my table with the notebook again. I wrote 3 columns: who came when I called, who offered when I didn't, who expects to be paid in applause for basic decency. It felt monstrous, like I was carving people into lists. But the lists weren't punishments. They were a map to safety. On Wednesday, I asked Mom to come with me to look at an apartment I said I couldn't afford. She said she'd love to, and then called the next morning to say her friend needed her to drive to the airport and could I reschedule. On Friday, Leah texted at 5:12 a.m. Car won't start. I'm on my way on foot anyway. Save me a honey bun. On Sunday, Dad dropped off a bag of groceries by accident, all my favorites, including the cheap peanut butter I pretend to prefer because it tastes like childhood and pride. Then came the knock I wasn't expecting. My landlord Miguel stood in the hallway looking like a man who preferred to be anywhere else. Cassie, he began, scratching his cheek. I hate this. The owner is selling. Everyone's got 60 days. I nodded. My stomach floated up like a balloon. He looked at his shoes. If you need an extension, I'll lie for you. When he left, I put my forehead on the cool table and let myself cry for exactly 1 song on the radio. Then I blew my nose, circled a date on my calendar, and realized the next phase had arrived on schedule, without my scheduling it. I was going to ask for more than money. I was going to ask for time, attention, presence. The expensive things love sometimes refuses to pay. Here is the part I didn't expect testing people tests you too. Each ask felt like lifting a mirror to my own face and asking, who have you been to them? Have you answered midnight calls? Have you lent money you couldn't spare? Have you shown up without asking to be thanked? The answers were inconvenient and honest. I have been a wallet with a laugh attached. I have been a ride and a roof and a steady yes. I have also been silent when I should have told the truth. I closed the notebook and stared at the dark window where my face floated like a moon. Okay, I told her. We'll be brave. We'll be kind. And when we give, we'll call it love, not leverage. The money waited in my account like a tide. I felt it pressing against the edges of everything, wanting to rush in and change the shape of the shore. But tides are patient. And so for 1 more week, I would be too. 1 more week of asking. 1 more week of seeing. 1 more week before I flipped the lens and let them see me fully for the first time. A week later, I stood in the bakery parking lot again, this time watching the morning light turn the glass storefronts gold. The hum inside me had changed. The money was still there, quiet and obedient in the bank, but the secret had begun to feel heavier. Secrets are strange that way. They start as protection and end as prisons. I decided it was time to open the door, but I didn't want to drop the truth like a bomb. I wanted to place it like a seed, gently, deliberately, where it could grow into understanding, not destruction. So I began with the person who had passed every invisible test. That evening, Leah came over with leftover Thai food and a story about her boss that could have fueled a stand-up special. She noticed I was distracted. Okay, she said, pointing a fork at me. You're either in love or hiding a body. Which is it? Neither, I said, and took a breath that felt like standing on a cliff. I need to tell you something big. She listened without interrupting as I told her about the ticket, the numbers, the office, the zeros. When I finished, Her mouth was still open, but her eyes were steady. "You tested us, didn't you?" she said finally. I nodded. I needed to know who I was to everyone before money decided for them. She exhaled, shook her head, then laughed a short, broken laugh that melted into tears. "Cassie, you're impossible. But I get it. And I'm glad you told me. I don't want your money. I just don't want you to vanish into it." That sentence was love in its purest form. Not a hand reaching out for something, but a hand staying put so you could come back to it. The next day I told Dad. He listened with the quiet that has always been his gift. When I finished, he rubbed his chin and said, "Your mom's going to make a spreadsheet out of this." I laughed for the first time in days. Then he added, "You don't owe anyone anything, not even explanations. But if you're going to share it, make sure it builds something instead of just proving something." That night I wrote his words in the margin of my notebook: "Build, don't prove." When I finally told the rest of the family, it didn't go like the movies. There was no group hug, no sudden redemption. Mason's first reaction was disbelief that turned into wounded pride. Renee alternated between awe and irritation that I hadn't told her sooner. Mom cried, but the tears felt organized, like they knew where to go. "I don't understand," she said. "You asked us for help. You let us look bad." "I didn't let you," I said softly. "I just watched." Mason left early. Renee stayed long enough to ask if I'd consider investing in her wellness business now that I could afford to lose money. I told her maybe later, which meant never. After they left, Mom stood in the doorway, wringing her hands. "I'm proud of you," she said. "But I wish you hadn't tested us." I met her eyes. "You've been testing me my whole life, seeing how much I can give before I break." This was my turn. She didn't answer. She just touched my cheek, half apology, half habit, and left. The following months taught me that wealth doesn't change people. It just turns up the volume on who they already were. Mason sent texts about investment opportunities. Renee posted photos of herself tagged had family goals with captions like, "So proud of my generous sister." Mom called every few days to check in, which always circled back to mortgages, bills, numbers. But Leah came over with paint samples for the apartment I'd finally bought. Dad helped install shelves. Miguel, my old landlord, dropped by with a bag of bagels and refused to let me pay him back for the kindness he'd once shown. And me? I kept working at the bakery for a while, not for money, but for rhythm. For the smell of yeast and sugar, for the way customers say thank you when they mean you're part of my morning. I told the owner I'd cover the wages for an extra pair of hands so she could take weekends off. She cried and hugged me, leaving a dusting of flour on my sweater. One evening, Mason came over unannounced. He stood on my new porch, looking out of place in his dealership suit. "I messed up," he said simply. "You asked for help and I made it about me. I don't want your money. I just don't want us to stay broken." I believed him. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about letting the wound stop introducing itself every time you move. Later that week, Renee sent me a text with a picture of her holding a box of tea and a sheepish grin, still hustling. Trying to do it honest this time, I heart reacted. It was small, but small is where change begins. Mom took the longest. It wasn't until Thanksgiving that she looked at me across the table, her hands folded around her wineglass, and said, "I understand now. You just wanted to know who would show up with empty hands." I smiled. Exactly. Months later, I sat on the beach Leah and I had always promised to visit when we made it. The water was a silver sheet, the horizon quiet and forgiving. I thought about the notebook waiting at home, its pages filled with the experiments that led me here. Every question I'd written had been answered, just not the way I expected. Money had not made me powerful. It had made me visible to others, yes, but mostly to myself. It had shown me where love ends and obligation begins. It had taught me that generosity without boundaries becomes servitude, and silence can be as sharp as speech. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped on Dad's name. I sent a message. "Thinking about building something, for all of us, but this time I'll choose the foundation." He replied with a single word: proud. The tide crept closer, foam tracing the edges of my footprints. I whispered into the wind, half prayer, half promise, "I'll build, not prove." And I meant it. If this story reached you tonight, if it reminded you that true wealth isn't measured in numbers, but in who stays when you have nothing. Please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that begin in silence and end in truth. And tell me in the comments, what would you test the world for if you could?